So you don't say anything?
Okay. Hey everybody, Diane, Harmon, Keller Williams Realty. We're the Harmon Murphy Group here in Pensacola, Florida, and we've got a subject we're going to talk to you about today. We're going to talk about net sheets. We're talking about net sheets for sellers and net sheet for buyers, just to kind of give you an overview of what you're looking at when you're selling a house and when you're buying a house. I'm here with Tracy Gaines, Lucas Smith, and Donald Cole, and it's going to be a great conversation today, so listen in. So, Lucas, let's talk about the seller's net sheet. You have questions about that?
I do. So my question, on a traditional net sheet, it always shows that certain things are always the responsibility for certain people. But when we start coming up with creative solutions for certain deals, it gets confusing on where you can allocate certain things for responsibility to help make the deal happen on one side or the other, being either the buyer or the seller side. So what are things that which person has to pay for what always, and which things on the fee sheet can be shifted to the buyer or a seller,
right,
to make the deal work.
Okay, so here's the thing about the seller's net sheet. So you got to keep in mind, if you're a buyer, let's just talk about a buyer for the first time. If you're a buyer and you're buying a home, you can always ask, your real estate agent can always ask for the seller to pay a portion of your closing costs. So let's just talk what that looks like. So if you're a VA buyer, one of the reasons that they say VA buyers, it gets 100% financing is because anytime they're getting a loan, they're allowed to roll in their VA funding fee into their loan. So let's just say, and let's use rounded numbers, just so if they're buying a house at $200,000 and they've got their VA funding fee, so now if that VA funding fee is like $5,400, now the price is not $200,000, but it's, you add the $5,400 to it, so now it's $2,554 or whatever that is, so their loan amount goes up. However, the guidelines for VA allows the seller to pay a portion or all of that up to 6%. So you take that purchase price times 6%, that's what the seller is allowed to pay. It doesn't mean the seller has to pay it. Seller doesn't have to pay anything. They don't have to pay any of the buyer's closing costs. But in the normal conditions here, and it's been this way since I got in real estate in 2006, that sellers pay it traditionally on board all the time. If you're an FHA buyer, you can pay closing costs for them as well, but that doesn't mean you have to pay closing costs. So that's what happens when you're a buyer. When you're a seller, on the seller's net sheet, the standard things on 2 Florida contracts that we use here in the state of Florida, that's the FAR bar contract and the CRISP contract. And on those, it says that a seller's costs are the owner's title and search fees. And what that means, you as a seller, the title company or the attorney's office has to do a search to find out if you have clear title on your property. If you don't have clear title, the property can't be sold. So there's charges for that search. You got a search fee of about $500. You got your owner's title. Now, if you've purchased your home in the last 3 years, you can get a reissue credit. You can turn in that owner's title policy to the title company. They'll give you a reissue credit of about $400. Could be $250, could be $300, could be $400. Saves you a little bit of money. Those standard costs for you as a seller depends on the purchase price, but it's normally somewhere around $1,000 to $1,500, just depending on the purchase price of the home. So within that, the title and settlement fees, you've got the closing fee, you've got owner's title insurance search fee, and your municipal lien search. That's what's going to be done through just about every single title company. You've got what's called deed doc stamps or transfer tax, and that is a deed recording fee to record into public records relative to the transfer of title on a property paid by the seller at closing. The largest thing that a seller is going to have on their net sheet is going to be the real estate commissions. Well, you've got real estate professionals who are, number one, not only doing a CMA to price your home, but they're great at negotiations. They're great at getting you to the closing table. They're great at capping the warranted repairs that are standard on a buyer contract. Because you've got to remember, when a seller is selling their home and you have a buyer's contract, that contract is really for the buyer. They don't really care about the seller. It's all about the buyer. So you've got capped warranty repairs, you've got capped WDO and termite repairs, you've got open permits. That's one of the things that we talk about in a different subject, a different YouTube video, was about the base square footage of a home. So if there was any open permits, so we're going to cap that for you so that you really, because if you go off the contract, if you don't fill in an amount, it defaults to 1.5% of the purchase price. So if you're looking at selling a home for $200,000, that's quite a bit of money. So as, for us as agents, we're gonna cap that. So when we talk, that's your standard cost. Now here's what happens, everything in a real estate deal is negotiable. If a buyer wants to pay all this cost for a seller, they can. They can do anything they want to. This is between the buyer and the seller, but your standard cost are your owner's title, search and related fees, your deed doc stamps, your real estate commissions, your prorated property tax. You've got to remember, taxes in here are paid in arrears. So right now, you're collecting up taxes either, if you paid cash for your house, you're collecting those up to be paid in November. If you have a loan on your home, right now they're in your escrow account because they're taking out money each month for your taxes and insurance, putting it in this escrow account. So when you go to closing, you have those prorated property tax or prorated HOA dues. Most of the HOA dues around here, if there's any, is about $200 to $250. That's about standard. If you're in some of your higher end communities, it could be as much as $1,200. So those will always be prorated. The stuff for a buyer's net sheet is totally the different because a buyer has everything that's mortgage related. And so if you figure out their cost, if you take the purchase price times about 4.75% or 5%, that's gonna be the standard closing cost that that buyer is gonna need. You know, really to find out the closing costs, you need to talk to a local lender, somebody that does this for a living. You've got to remember, we're real estate professionals. We're not lenders, we're not title people, but we do this, been doing this for a long time. So Luker, what do you have to add to that?
Well, sitting down with the seller specifically and showing them this net sheet, and it says that they have to pay for all these things. Well, it doesn't say that they have to, it's that you're suggesting, you know, best case scenario, or the most common scenario is
Right.
that they do pay for these things.
Exactly.
So where I got stumped up when the lady asked me is, why am I paying for these things? I don't know, it's on the sheet and they said you got to, so you got to.
Yeah.
You know, it's like.
Well, it's a
what
standard,
do you-
yeah, it's a standard seller cost. And what I always do, one of the great things to do is when you're going on a listing appointment, is have a contract, a buyer's contract with you. Have those areas highlighted, because here's what happens, standard that a buyer's gonna ask for. I don't think I've ever gotten a contract that the buyer doesn't ask for a home warranty. Standard home warranty is like $420. You know, and it can go up a little bit higher if you have a pool or stuff like that. However, you want to show them on the seller net sheet everything that could come up. The only thing I never put on that net sheet is any buyer's closing costs. We don't know if that's going to be a cash buyer. We don't know what kind of buyer it is. And just because they ask for it doesn't mean the seller has to pay it. Because there's a quick way to find out real fast whether that buyer really does need it. Because I guarantee you one thing, if Donald's my buyer, and he's a VA buyer, and he may be a colonel, and he don't need any closing costs, we're gonna ask for closing costs. We're gonna ask for it because the seller can pay it. And then if the seller don't wanna pay it, then it just goes back to the buyer and say, hey, what do you wanna do? And Donald might say, well, hey, I'll pay my own closing costs because I really love the house. So there's no harm or no foul in trying, because you gotta remember, as real estate professionals, we just take ourselves out of it because it's really between the buyer and the seller. Buyer and seller is the one that makes the decisions. And what we're trying to do is get parties to come to the meeting of the minds. So in this case, with this lady, these are the standard costs that's on a buyer's contract. Any contract, you're gonna see that it says buyer's cost are, and it's gonna list out owner's title, settlement fees, attorney costs, deed doc stamps. And then it's gonna go on to talk about the buyer and what the buyer's responsible for. But again, it's both back between the buyer and the seller. But yeah, the standard cost. So in this case, the listing price, suggested listing price based on what the market said was $179. After all those closing costs that would be incurred by a seller, their net walkaway would be like $163,562. Unless, you know, that's if they got full price and there was no other closing cost concessions or anything else in there. So, you know, the lady just was a little stumped because she felt like she could just sell her house and not pay any cost at all. Maybe even, what about the real estate commission? Did she even want to pay that?
She didn't have a problem with commission.
She just had a problem with the other fees.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so buyers and sellers have to understand there's a lot of costs. Does somebody have a calculator in here that they can just do the math? So Tracy, at 179,000 times, just give me 5%. What would the standard closing cost be for a buyer?
So 5% is 9,000.
Okay, so that's about $9,000. So, you know, if you're looking at a home about 179, 180, 200,000, whatever that looks like, you can normally do about 5%, and that's the amount of closing costs that a buyer is gonna need. So for this seller, her closing costs, what is that, Luca? 63, 73. That's, what is that, about $15,000?
Just right at 15.
Right at $15,000. So as a seller, it's around $15,000, and for the buyer, it's $9,000. And not every buyer, because number one, you gotta remember, they're putting 3.5% down, okay? If they're FHA or anything, they're putting 3.5%. Tracy, what's 3.5% times 179?
6,200.
6,200. So right now, the buyer, and just, you know, this is good information you can pass along to the seller, is that they're having to put 3.5% down, which is 6,200, and they need $9,000. Now, they're right at $15,000. So it's about $15,000 for the seller and about $15,000 for the buyer. So now when you're saying, hey, Mr. Seller, by the way, can you pick up another 15 grand? Or another 10 grand? Or another 5 grand? On the seller's behalf, guess what they're gonna do? They're gonna go to the next house, more than likely. So, is there anything specific maybe on a buyer's net sheet, Luca, that you wanna talk about?
I don't think so. I mean, as far as like the ones that Surety provides, I don't like to use those because it doesn't calculate, like you just explained, the difference between the down payment and the closing costs.
Right.
So a lot of times when you put in concessions, it'll take it away from a down payment, and on an FHA or specifically an FHA loan, it's mandated that they put at least 3.5% down.
Right.
So when you pass a buyer's estimate, and I've seen lenders do it too, where they add the credit to the down payment, and it shows that somebody's gonna get a $200 credit at closing, and they still owe $8,000 in the down payment. So they're very confusing. Like you, both of you have always told me, don't do fee sheets for buyers. Let the mortgage company.
Yeah, let the mortgage company do it. And I'll just tell you, you know, we're pretty good at what we do. We're very good at what we do, but you gotta remember, we're not a lender. And that lender is experienced. And we've got some lenders that's been in this business for over 30 years. They're great at what they do. And if you're working very closely with the lender, that lender ought to be able to tell you just about what the closing costs are gonna be. And what happens is when that buyer gets a fee sheet from the lender, it's very overinflated. And the reason for that is because I think about a year ago, there were some guidelines that changed, and now what they said is if that fee sheet isn't within a certain percentage, like 2 or 4%, then they're gonna start fining that lender. So lenders are very cautious, and they're way gonna overinflate a fee sheet because they don't wanna get trapped in that situation where, you know, they've undervalued the fees that are due. I know some of the standard fees on here, it may show that a survey is $800 on a fee sheet for a buyer, when actually a lot and block survey is about $395,000 to $395 to about $450. Now, if you've got acreage, you know, if you got 5 acres, it could be anywhere from $800 to $1,500. So you just have to kind of look at those fee sheets. They may have on the fee sheet for a buyer for a termite inspection to be like $250, when in fact it's about $100. So as you can see, some of these fees are overinflated. So really work with your lender to find out, you know, what that cost might look like. But I'm gonna tell you, my gut has been telling me for a very long time to use that 4.75 to 5%, and that is doggone close almost every single time. So that's been my rule of thumb for a long time. You know, right now interest rates are down, you know, they went up, they've come back down, you know, it's really a good time to buy. So anyways, just a little information about seller's cost and buyer's cost. Donald, do you have anything to add?
Just in the same respect, the contract can also change those numbers for a buyer, depending who's checked, if the buyer is going to choose title or if the seller is going to choose title. So it's important to work with your real estate professional and make sure that they're going through the contract and dictating what's written in the contract and who is going to pay for what.
Right.
Those are negotiable things.
Exactly. So here's what I told somebody just the other day. So we actually had a house listed. We had 3 contracts on the house. And in order to make somebody's contract look a little more favorable, what you might want to do is talk to your real estate professional and say, hey, I really want this house. I know they're going to be putting in other offers, so what do we do? And a real estate agent might suggest, okay, well, why don't we offer them $2,000 over list price and you pay the owner's title? So, you know, pay the owner's title, because now that's taking that burden off of that seller, or you can choose to do that 50-50. So you're paying half of it, they're paying half of it. So it may be that little bit of hump that gets you that house. Because number one, they're looking for a local lender, because, you know, most of us in Pensacola, Santa Rosa County area, we know so many of these lenders, if you've been in real estate for a while. So you know using someone local is a lot better than using someone that's out of state. You can pick up the phone and actually call them on the phone if you have an issue or a problem. But it's just like Donald said, you can choose to pay the owner's title insurance if you have a buyer, you can choose to pay half of it. You can make it any way you want to make that offer the very best offer.
Yeah, and on average, I mean, if the buyer's paying the owner's title or the seller's paying the owner's title, you know, it saves the seller, but on a fee sheet from a lender, they don't necessarily, they're gonna give you an estimate, and they don't necessarily know what's in the contract until they
Right.
see the contract.
Exactly.
So a lot of those fees can be pushed over to a buyer or a seller, and those numbers can change accordingly.
Absolutely, yeah. Anything else, guys?
I think
No?
so.
Okay, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be chatting with y'all again next Thursday. We'll have a different subject for you. So anyway, y'all make it a great Thursday.